288-3986.
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed their 4th of July holiday here in the year 2024. We are back with another edition of EWTN's Call to Communion. We ask that question every day. What is stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Perhaps you were together with some family that maybe you don't see on a regular basis, and maybe some conversations were started, and you have some questions that you'd like to have answers to, whether you are a Catholic talking to someone who is not Catholic, or perhaps you are a non-Catholic that was talking to some Catholic family members and don't understand some of the things that you were discussing. We would love to discuss those things with you today. Pick up the phone and give us a call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're outside the United States and Canada, we'd still love to talk to you. That number is 1-205-271-2985, and we'll even put you straight to the front of the line. You can always send us an email. That email address is ctc@ewtn.com. And you can text your question to Dr. Anders. Text the letters EWTN to the address 58177. We will send you a response and then respond to that text with your first name and a brief question, message, and data rates may apply. I'm Jack Williams, sitting in for Tom Price once again today. Pedro Quiles is our producer. Your call screener is Matt Gubensky. And Charles Beery, I believe, is handling our social media efforts. So if you're watching us on, it's Rich Jesse, actually, I think, is handling our social media efforts. But I'm sure Charles Beery is going to help him at some point. That's why I felt the need to say his name. But Rich is watching us on social media, so if you have a question there, you can type a question into the chat window, and it may get to us by the end of the hour. David Anders, how are you?
I'm fine. Oh, most patriotic one.
Yeah, that's me. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook Live, I have my annual wearing of the Stars and Stripes, and I was scolded by one of our Spanish Catholic radio team members that I wear this shirt every year, and I need to get a new shirt. So
I like it. I like it.
Mario would like to know if the Catholic Church was officially organized by Constantine.
No, actually, not at all. The church was officially organized by Jesus Christ, who founded it in 33 A.D.
Even Siri knows that, by the way.
Right. When he said to St. Peter, "Thou art Peter," which means rock, "and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. I'll be with you to the end of the age."
Keeping in mind, of course, his name was Simon.
That's right. That's right.
We gloss over that sometimes.
And not only did he establish St. Peter as the rock of the church's unity, but he gave us a more elaborate constitution even than that. So, in addition to St. Peter, of course, he appointed 12 apostles. One of them bit the dust, and they elected a successor. So there are basically 12 apostles that he commissioned to carry on this work of teaching the gospel and everything that he had commanded the church. And so he left an authority structure, namely the apostolic office. He left a body of doctrine, his oral tradition that he commanded be taught down through the centuries, and he left a formal structure for worship. He gave us the ministry of the sacraments and commanded that we do this in memory of him. So the basic constitution, the basic structure of the Catholic Church was established by Jesus Christ and really hasn't changed at all in 2,000 years. What has changed are basically embellishments and elaborations of that original model, but the original model remains intact. So what happened with Constantine? Constantine wasn't even a Christian. Wasn't even a Christian at the time of the Council of Nicaea. He was a catechumen. He hadn't even been baptized yet. And he had an interest as emperor to maintain peace within his dominions, and he recognized that there was a theological controversy at the heart of the Catholic faithful. And so he asked the bishops of the Catholic Church to get with the program and to resolve the controversy. And so he provided a kind of political impetus for the Council of Nicaea, but did not have any input in its outcome. Right? That was the bishops of the Catholic Church. And in addition to the Nicene Creed, which they gave us from that in subsequent councils, they also published a number of canons. Those are legal rulings about the organization, the polity of the church. And again, that was the bishops of the Catholic faith, not Constantine, who implemented those.
And John writes in, I know that with the advancement of biblical science, there is always a temptation to go back and reinterpret, but how much is too much? How can we reconcile the belief that the Holy Spirit guided the church and, for example, that the Vulgate is kind of obsolete?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. So I think the answer to your question is implicit in the Catholic doctrine of the Bible. So remember that the Catholic Church teaches that the Bible has two senses. It really has more than two, but two primary senses. What we call the literal sense of the text. That's what did the sacred author intend to communicate in his particular historical context. And the other is what we call the spiritual sense, which is the capacity of the text to spiritually transform the reader into a disciple of Jesus and to imprint upon him or her the mind of Christ. So it's more than just propositional learning. It's more than just information. The spiritual sense really involves a transformation of one's personality. This is easy to see if you go back and read the Fathers when they talk about the spiritual sense. They say you can't grasp the spiritual sense of Scripture if, for example, you're not practicing the virtues. And so in addition to things like learning Greek and Hebrew or Latin or whatever it might be, you need to fast. Well, modern higher biblical critics don't believe in the need for fasting and prayer before they take up their archaeology or their linguistic studies. So it really underscores the fact that the spiritual sense is something that's more than just scholarly academic learning. And so inspiration does, in fact, touch the very words of Scripture, but it doesn't leave it there, right? The inspiration goes deeper into this transformative power that the Bible has in human lives when it's read in the heart of the Catholic Church together with the sacraments under the guidance of the magisterium. And so for a Catholic, if you stay in that place, you're safe. You are safe. And amazing thing about the church is that if somebody starts veering too far outside, we have a system set up to go, sorry, buddy, you can't cross that boundary.
833-288-EWTN, that's our toll-free number. It's a free telephone call anywhere in the United States and Canada. 833-288-3986. It's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
At EWTN Radio, your family. And because you're a part of our family, we value your opinions on what you hear on EWTN. You can call our listener comment line 24/7 at 205-795-5773. We value your comments, your questions, and any suggestions you may have to make EWTN Radio even better. 205-795-5773. And thank you for listening to EWTN Radio.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
Human beings are God's greatest masterpiece. Every person is made in the image and likeness of God. But every saint, that is, every person who accepts God's invitation, his upward call to make them holy. And so every story presents us with a unique masterpiece that God is writing.
The Journey Home, Monday night, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and television.
This is Sister Lucia Trainer of the Franciscan Sisters of the Eucharist. Catholic radio is an apostolate that is immediate, interactive, effective, and worldwide. It stimulates listeners to follow the teachings of the Church, brings Scripture closer to us, helps those who wrestle with questions of conscience, and allows us to celebrate the joy of our faith every day.
The world needs EWTN Catholic Radio, now more than ever.
Hot off the presses for the month of July from EWTN Publishing. His Angels at Our Side, Understanding Their Power in Our Souls and in the World by our good friend Father John Horgan. He unveils the surprising role of angels in our lives and what we must do to gain their help. And did you know by praying with the angels, you'll be strengthened for what lies ahead and be better able to discern and do the Lord's will in all your actions? Check it out, His Angels at Our Side, Understanding Their Power in Our Souls and in the World by Father John Horgan, available now at EWTN's Religious Catalog. It's EWTNRC.com. 833-288-EWTN, that's our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. First up today is Benjamin in Western Michigan, listening on our blowtorch in the northern suburbs of Chicago, WSFI-FM. Benjamin, you are on with Dr. David Anders.
Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate everything you guys do. Great job. Thank you so much. It's in regards to the Eucharist revival. Me and my wife are both practicing Catholics, but she gets a little hung up on what's so special about that Eucharist procession versus just going to our local church to do adoration. I feel real strongly like being part of something bigger, once in a lifetime type of deal, but I don't know. I can't get her to see that. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah, thanks. Well, Benjamin, you took the words right out of my mouth. You took the words right out of my mouth. It seems to me that the motive that one might have to participate in the National Eucharistic Congress is precisely the sense of solidarity with the National Catholic Church, that this is an event that enables people from all over the country to come together and affirm their common belief in the Lord and in the Eucharist. And that can be highly motivating for some. I mean, to take an analogy, the number of kids, young people, teenagers, that have had conversion experiences or found a vocation in the context of a national or international youth event where they go and they're in some stadium someplace. And it's not that they don't really learn anything new necessarily about the Catholic faith, except that, oh my gosh, there are a lot more Catholics than I thought there were. And, to a teenager who may feel somewhat alienated or embattled in their, in their heavily Southern Baptist neighborhood in Mississippi or something, to go and find out that there's actually millions of young Catholic people like them and that some of them are pretty cool, that realization motivates them. And many people have found vocations in places like World Youth Day, for example. And I think the motive would be very similar for a Catholic that wanted to participate in the Eucharistic Congress. Now, as soon as I say that, I also have to qualify. I said some people find that very motivating. Some people do. Some don't. And in particular, if you're the kind of person, maybe an extroverted sort, who likes being in large crowds with lots of sound and lights and music and finds that exhilarating, that's probably a really good environment. I don't know your wife's personality, but just, one person who might not be motivated by that, someone who maybe is agoraphobic and introverted, right? That may not be the best place for them to grow closer to the Lord. And it's quite possible that for some soul, quiet adoration in their local Eucharistic adoration chapel is a better option. And so, the church doesn't have a one-size-fits-all spirituality. It has a one-size-fits-all liturgy. I mean, Christ gave us the Eucharist. That's normative for all Catholics. But the way we relate to the Eucharist and to other forms of prayer life within the church, this is why there are different religious orders. Not everybody is a Jesuit. Not everybody is a Dominican. Not everybody is a Benedictine. And not every Catholic has to practice the same personal spirituality.
But what one thing she does assert is absolutely true. Jesus is no less present.
Same Jesus
in that procession as he is in their local church. Does that help out a little bit, Benjamin?
It sure does. And Dr. Anders, are you ever going to do a charity debate with Jordan Peterson? Have you heard of his wife having that miracle that came through?
So I'm familiar with Dr. Peterson. I've heard some things about his wife. You asked about a debate. I don't particularly want to debate Jordan Peterson. I rather like the guy, and I'd love to sit down and have a conversation with him. I don't have a lot to pick on him for, But my policy is I typically go where I'm asked, and as of yet, Dr. Peterson has not come knocking. So I think he's got bigger fish to fry than me.
Thanks, Benjamin. We appreciate the phone call today. That opens up a line for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Jeffrey writes in, how does someone stay in a state of grace with the fact of sin in our lives? Going to confession isn't always possible since priests are limited in the time they can spend in the confessional. There are times I need a priest, and physical limitations don't permit one to be available. Is confessing directly to God valid in such circumstances?
Okay, so I really need to attack this from two different angles. First of all, your question presumes the inevitability of mortal sin. that I'm just gonna fall into mortal sin. Now, as somebody who falls into mortal sin, I'm sympathetic to that concern. However, I can't leave that unaddressed, because the presumption in the Catholic faith is that we will not fall into mortal sin, that mortal sin is not the normal state of the Christian soul. And so, it is easy to fall into the pattern of a habitual sin where I commit the sin, I go to confession. I commit the sin, I go to confession. I commit the sin, I go to confession. And I do that for years. If that is the case, then the indications are there's something lacking in my spiritual practice, that the way I'm engaging the life of the sacraments isn't sufficient. But we know that the sacraments are sufficient. We know that the church is sufficient for me to do this. So what am I leaving out? And there is an entire realm of Catholic reflection on what's called spiritual theology that is about growth in holiness. And there are some very specific things that the fathers and the doctors of the church say. So one of them is that you really can't start the path on growing in holiness without what's called the purgative stage of the spiritual life, and that is undertaking ascetical disciplines that are designed to root out these immoderate attachments that you have in your life. Now, what asceticism just means you denying yourself, okay? What ascetical discipline you undertake will depend on what your primary fault is. So let's just take one at random. Let's just say that you have a problem with strong drink, and you drink too much, and that's a problem for you. Well, what you would need to do to begin with is not just make an act of will and go, well, I'm going to stop drinking too much. No, that's actually not sufficient. What you have to do is start putting real serious barriers and habits in place in your life that will make it impossible for the temptation to arise. That's why we say in the act of contrition, I'm going to avoid whatever leads me to sin. Now, I don't know what that is in your case. So let's say hypothetically, you walk down a certain street and your favorite bar is on that street. And every time you go down the street, you see the bar and you start thinking, and the next thing you know, you're walking in the door. So step number one would be, don't walk down that street. Take another route home. And just extrapolate that principle across your whole life. What are the occasions of sin for you? Start proactively organizing your life to avoid those occasions of sin until the new habit patterns are so ingrained that those occasions of sin are either no longer occasions of sin, or if they remain so, you just permanently avoid them. And then you don't have those occasions of sin, you don't have those temptations arise. You have to implement spiritual disciplines in your daily routine that change your thought life so that it's not only your physical habits, but your cognitive habits are reoriented. And again, Catholic spirituality is varied, a lot of ways to do this. Some person, for example, might want to follow the practices of Ignatian spirituality, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius that involve a lot of meditation upon the life of Christ and the apostles. So as you kind of internalize Jesus' point of view, the old bracelets we used to have, what would Jesus do? Very good principle. If you sort of make part of your daily practice, constantly ruminating on what would Christ do, what would the saints do, what would my patron saint do, what would my grandfather have done in this situation. It helps create the right motivational set, the right kind of ideas. There are other spiritual practices. Go investigate them. Learn the ones that work for you so that you can change your behaviors and your thought patterns so that temptations won't arise. Now, when you've done that, if you still fall into mortal sin and you do not have access to the confessional, then you make an act of perfect contrition. That's what you do. As soon as you have opportunity, God, I'm sorry for offending you because you are all good and are worthy of all of my love. That's an act of perfect contrition. And you mean it. And yes, the church teaches that absolves you of mortal sin, restores you to the state of grace. It does not, however, absolve you of your canonical obligation to make it to the confessional at the first moment available.
Leslie's up next in the Republic of Texas, listening on Guadalupe Radio today. And Leslie, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, Dr. Anders. Thank you for taking my call, and thank you for being a huge part of why I'm Catholic now. And my question is, I did not feel anything after my first confession.
Oh, thank goodness.
And during it, there was a phone call taken. We were just in a room, and I had confessed those same sins to Episcopal priest in the past, and I thought it would be different, but I don't know. Is it okay?
Okay, I got a lot to say. I'm so glad you called me. Thank you so much for calling me. I really, really am glad to take this call. Number one, let me say something about the priest who carries a live phone in the confessional. Shame, 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 shame on that priest. Bad, 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 bad sacramental practice. Several years ago, the former head of the Congregation of Divine Worship gave an address to the missionaries of mercy, Pope Francis's missionaries of mercy. I know this because I happen to know one of them, and he was at the address. And he absolutely just chewed out and castigated priests that carry live phones into the confessional. That is a no-go. You do not do that, because the priest has an obligation to give you his full attention, and so he can really be a spiritual father and have the care of souls. That's what the job is all about. So that you were really mistreated, right, to be subjected to a phone call in the middle of the confessional. I am so sorry that happened to you. And my recommendation was, in the future, maybe find a different confessor. I wouldn't necessarily go to that guy again. And you might even consider putting in a word to the chancery at your diocese and say, hey, this priest is carrying a live phone, taking phone calls during confession. I guarantee you his bishop is not going to be excited to hear that. Now, in terms of you didn't feel anything, that is just fantastic. I am so glad you didn't feel anything. I really am, and I'll tell you why. Because the way the sacraments work in our lives, the way they are effective to help us grow in holiness, is not primarily through our passions, through our sentimentality. They can work that way, of course, and for many people they do, but primarily they work in us through our spiritual faculties, which are not sentimental. See, animals have sentiments, animals have emotions, they don't have immortal souls. What makes us in God's likeness and image is our immaterial intellect and the capacity of freedom, our free will, that is a consequence of being intellectual creatures. And so emotions can be a context for moral action. They can motivate moral action, but proper moral action comes from right understanding, right? That I have a rational understanding of what the good is and of my need to do it for my own flourishing and the flourishing of my family and my community and the honor of God. And to do so in the absence of sensible emotion is actually more meritorious. More moral good derives to you when you act without sensible emotion than when you have all kinds of warm, ushy-cushy feelings. And if you don't believe me, look at the person of Jesus. Look at the greatest test he underwent as a human being in his human life. This is in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he's contemplating the prospect of the crucifixion. And St. Luke tells us that Jesus sweat blood, and his agonized word was, Lord, take this cup from me, but not my will, but thine be done, right? Christ didn't have ushy-cushies on his way to the cross, and yet he did what was needful. I have a son who's into mixed martial arts, and through him I learned about a T-shirt company that publishes T-shirts now that say Jesus didn't tap. Right? If you know what that means in MMA, you tap out when somebody's breaking your arm behind your back. Jesus didn't tap. He didn't. He didn't give in. He did the hard thing, even though he didn't feel like it. That's the essence of the spiritual life. And it's lovely to have nice feelings, but the problem with people who have these mountaintop experiences when they first go to the sacraments is they think that's normative. And then, 5 years later, 10 years later, they experience aridity in the presence of the sacraments, which is normal. All the saints talk about this. And they think, well, something must be missing. Or worse, maybe I need to go look elsewhere. No. You're right where you need to be.
Thanks, Leslie. We appreciate the call today. 833-288-EWTN. That's our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Andrew's watching us on YouTube, and he says, Dr. Anders, I understand you come from a Calvinist background. In the process of your conversion, how did you overcome the Marian dogmas? I have friends who are open to devotions to Mary.
Yeah, I think he means, how did I overcome my resistance to the Marian dogmas? I didn't overcome any Marian dogmas. I submitted to the Marian dogmas. So here's how it works, for me, at any rate. And my story is different, and it may be different for you. My path to the Blessed Virgin Mary started not with Mary, but it started with the saints. And I was a historian, still am, sort of. And I was investigating the Reformed objection to Catholic spiritual practice. It was a big part of my doctoral dissertation. And of course, that brought me face to face with Calvin's critique of relics. John Calvin, who I wrote my dissertation on, had a whole treatise against relics. And he mocked them and derided them and said they were silly and superstitious. And so in order to deal honestly with Calvin's critique of relics, I dug really deeply into the literature on relics, historically. And one of the things I found from non-Catholic historians, guys like Peter Brown and Ramsay MacMullen, was that in ancient Christianity, that the devotion to the relics of saints was ubiquitous. That you could go anywhere in the ancient Christian world, and if you had Christians, you had devotion to saints and their relics. And it struck me that there was very little in ancient Christianity that had that much unanimity. Even the idea of Christ being divine was divisive in ancient Christianity, but devotion to saints was not. St. Jerome once said, "Does the Bishop of Rome do wrong? And all the bishops throughout the world, when they offer the holy sacrifice over the bones of Peter and Paul?" Right? The absolute ubiquity of the practice. And so I thought, okay, I need to get my head wrapped around saints. And Jack is giving me the signal to be quiet. So we'll have to come back after the break, and I'll explain how that works.
Also, straight ahead, we'll talk to Ferguson in the great state of Maryland, and we've got plenty of time for your phone calls as well. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. It's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Pope Francis tells us, becoming a priest or a man or woman religious is not primarily our own decision. Rather, it's the response to a call of love. Do you feel as if God may be calling you to religious life? If so, contact a religious order faithful to the magisterium or your diocesan vocation. For information on the priesthood or religious life, visit EWTN.com/religious life today.
Hey, this is Michael O'Neill, the Miracle Hunter. Have a safe and happy Independence Day weekend from all of us at EWTN Radio.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
The people of Washington State and a supermajority of the legislature passed an initiative giving school parents the right to preview materials, inspect records, and opt out of things like sexual health education that promotes abortion, among other things. It survived a lawsuit by the ACLU, and then State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reichdahl, told the state's nearly 300 school districts to ignore the law. An elected official told public employees to break the law. This is an incredible arrogance. Even the Democrat-controlled legislature knew better than to fight the people on this wildly popular initiative. The man defied the will of the people, the will of the legislature, and the law to accommodate the radical left. I hope there's a way to recall this rogue servant of the people.
Follow us on social media at Life Issues Institute.
This is EWTN, Catholic Radio.
I'm Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. Join me for Beacon of Truth, today at 4 p.m. Eastern.
On the next Beacon of Truth, we're talking about evangelism with Deacon Larry Owani and Soulful Song 82.
Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Congratulations going out to another member of the EWTN radio family. Our Ladies Radio, WWGL, in Steubenville, Ohio, is celebrating 9 years with EWTN. Congratulations to the Daughters of Holy Mary of the Heart of Jesus in Steubenville from your friends here at EWTN. All right, you're talking about your Calvinist overcomings of the
dogma.
resistance to Marian dogma.
Yeah, exactly. So before the break, I was explaining how I really came up against the reality of saints and their relics and how important it was to ancient Christians. You couldn't go anywhere in the ancient church without having saints and their relics. And that was even more ubiquitous and uncontroversial than, say, the divinity of Christ, about which we had to have a whole church council to settle that issue, but never so with the issue of relics. So I asked myself this question as a young Calvinist. How is it that I can claim continuity with ancient Christianity? Any kind of claim that the Reformation is a return to ancient Christianity, and reject devotion to saints and their relics, since it was ubiquitous. There were no ancient Christians who didn't do this thing. And either I have to get rid of my claim that I'm in continuity with the ancient church, if I want to get rid of relics, or I've got to come to terms with relics and the saints. And so I began to investigate it with an open mind, and I began to see how the idea of devotion to relics was, as St. Gregory of Nyssa put it, venerating Christ and his members. St. Paul talks about our being united with Christ through baptism, that we become members of his body. And he means this not just in a metaphorical, but in a very real, although mystical sense. We become members of Christ himself through baptism. And that's why St. Paul can say, I fill up in my own flesh what's lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. That we have a real participation, a real cooperation in the work of redemption, not in a way that supersedes Jesus, but in the way that appropriates the grace of Christ on the cross and enables us to be a source of grace and light to other people. And since the logic of redemption in the New Testament, as I understood it, is this very sort of corporate, collective salvation where we become members of one another in Christ, and that God condescends to distribute his grace to us through human instruments. We have become Christ's co-laborers, Paul says, as if God were making his appeal through us. That this dynamic of mutual prayer and intercession, which is commanded by the Bible, St. James says, pray for one another, is really integral to what it means to be a Christian, that I'm not saved by myself alone with a personal relationship with Jesus. I'm saved in and through and by my participation in a corporate body that is the Catholic Church, of which I am made a member by my baptism and in consequence a member of Jesus. So once I had that perspective, suddenly the idea of devotion to saints and saints' intercession from me went from being something I perceived as superstitious to something I saw as now absolutely integral to the practice of the Christian faith, to what it in fact means to be a Christian, that I am joined with this great cloud of witnesses in heaven, that the church is this one triumphant body, stretching from heaven all the way down to purgatory and including us, poor guys in the middle, all engaged in this magnificent course of praise and tending ultimately towards union with God. It was just an intoxicating vision once I got my head wrapped around it. Once I had that picture, integrating the Blessed Virgin Mary into that was quite easy. She was just the greatest of all the saints, the one that had the plenitude of grace. And so her role, while unique, she's qualitatively different from the other saints insofar as she's the Mother of God. All right? Insofar as she's the Mother of God, she's qualitatively different. But in terms of the logic of how grace works it out in the individual soul, she's just quantitatively different. That she has a superior level of holiness and a supreme level of grace in view of that dignity of being the Mother of God. And so the way her intercession works, it's supremely powerful because she's supremely holy. But she's just one of the saints in that regard. And so it was easy for me to integrate her. And then in terms of acceding to the doctrines, I came to believe that Christ established the church and gave her divine authority. What she binds on earth is bound in heaven. And so if the church says this thing is true, then that's true. Any Protestant who comes to the Bible comes with an implicit faith that all it says is true. Before he's even read the Bible, he's already pre-committed to the idea that he's going to believe the Bible no matter what it says. And listen, the Bible says some pretty tough stuff to believe, but he's pre-committed to it. Well, the Catholic brings that same attitude, that same disposition of implicit faith. He brings it to the authority that Christ actually did institute, which is the Catholic Church.
We head now to Maryland. Ferguson is in Maryland, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130 today. Ferguson, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Dr. Anders, how are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. How about you?
Excellent. It's always a pleasure listening to you on radio and seeing you and listening to you on TV.
Well, I appreciate that.
I had a question. I tried to get in on Wednesday. I couldn't make it, and I even switched into Father Mitchell's program concerning the Trinity and the Triune God. It must have been an interesting day about that. So it reached upon the subject that I've been wanting to discuss. Father Mitch kind of sort of answered what I was thinking. One caller called in and wanted to discuss the roles of the Triune God, and Father Mitch kind of came back with, there aren't really roles. There wasn't one guy who says, I'm going to do creation while you go down here and create man, and you do this, you split the seeds type thing. So if there aren't any distinctive roles between the Triune God, the question I have in the Bible when it talks about people wanting to know the end of days, and it states that, but about the day or the hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So my question has always been, when Jesus says, when you see me, you see the Father, why is this in Matthew?
Absolutely. I appreciate the question. So, of course, Catholic theologians, they know about Matthew. They know about John. They've been reading those books a long time, and so this is not a new issue in Trinitarian thought. And here's how the Catholic Church traditionally handles that question. We believe that Christ is fully God and fully human, and we believe that the natures are perfectly united in the person of Christ without separation or confusion. And what that means is Jesus is not two separate people stuck together like an Oreo cookie, but he really is one integrated person that has two natures. And so anything that you can predicate of one nature, you can predicate of the other. And that's why you could touch Jesus' hand and say, I'm touching the hand of God. Now, the divine nature as such doesn't have a hand. The divine nature is immaterial. But the person has a hand because the person has a human nature. And the person is both God and man. So you could say, God has a hand. You could also say of Jesus, the man, he's omniscient. Because the divine nature is omniscient, and Jesus, the man, is a man, but he's also God. And so anything you can say of the one nature, you can predicate of the person. But it's also possible to perform an abstraction, as I've already done in this call, and to speak about attributes that are properly attributes ascribable to a particular kind of nature. And so things like omniscience, for example, are not predicable of humanity as such. They're predicable of humanity when it's united to divinity, but not of humanity as such. I mean, I'm a human nature, and I'm not omniscient. A passibility, the ability to die, is something that is predicable of human nature as such and not predicable of the divine nature as such, even though it was predicable of the divine nature when united to a human being in the person of Jesus. All right. And so we have these strict rules about how we use language with respect to the person of Jesus that takes into account the reality of the two natures hypostatically conjoined. With that in view, when we talk about Christ not knowing something, we're performing a mental operation, an abstraction, where we are abstracting the human nature only in thought and in language, and saying that insofar as the human nature did not have any historical acquired knowledge, like, say, from the prophets, about the time of the end of days. Jesus, in the same way that Jesus, the human being who grew up in the Holy Land 2,000 years ago, could have said, when I was in school, they taught me Hebrew, but we never studied Mandarin, right? In that same kind of way. Now, could the Son of God have spoken Mandarin if he'd needed to? Of course he could have, because he's omnipotent. But, insofar as he was a human living in the Holy Land 2,000 years ago, they didn't teach Mandarin to little Hebrew boys back then. And so he didn't have acquired human knowledge of Mandarin. In the same way, information about the end of days was not part of the curriculum, as it were, for little Jewish boys growing up. That would have been something he could only have known in virtue of his divinity, not from his human nature.
Does that help, Ferguson?
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Cleared it all up. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Glad to
We
help.
appreciate the phone call. 833-288 EWTN is our toll-free number. Next up is Evangeline in Fremont, Nebraska, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Evangeline, you are on with Dr. Anders.
Hi. Thank you for taking my question. My question, I am Catholic, but as we read through the Bible with Father Mike Schmidt, we came to chapter 6 of Baruch, and I went back and read because many lines stood out to me as things that we do. This is under the futility of idols and idolatry. And as he was reading, and as I also went back and read, many of the things mentioned here sound like the pious practices that we do in the Catholic Church, and I didn't know how I would explain this to a non-Catholic person or even my child.
Yeah.
Some lines that stood out to me were overlaid with gold and silver. These are the idols. Make crowns for their heads. I was thinking of the Mount of Mary. Deck their gods out with garments and dressed in purple robes.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the question. So in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, there is a beautiful paragraph, and off the top of my head, I cannot pull it for you. I need to memorize the number. Beautiful paragraph that talks about popular religious devotion and its relationship to, say, the liturgy of the Church or to the dogmas of the Church. And it says, look, these kinds of pious practices and devotional practices, they can be quite wonderful. They can be quite edifying. In particular, as they tend to unite us in a communitarian sort of way with our communities or maybe with our cultural traditions, and they can really undergird our humane values of those things, of the humane value of community, of solidarity, of fidelity, of faithfulness, of a sense of journeying together towards God. And those things are really edifying. And so the church encourages these popular religious practices. But it also goes on to say that the bishops of the Catholic Church have an ongoing, serious duty to continually critique and refine the popular practice of devotion, lest it be infected by any form of superstition. And superstition is when our religious feelings and thoughts are deflected in some way from their true aims that what they ought to have. And so, if someone, for example, were to practice, an act of reverence towards a Marian statue, crowning the Blessed Virgin, something like that, with the idea that the statue was somehow going to come to life. Here, Jack has just circled the paragraph for me. It's a wonderful paragraph. Yes. Yep, that's it, 1676. You got it. You nailed it. Paragraph 1670 is a beautiful paragraph. If someone were to practice, say, a Catholic devotion to an image of the Blessed Virgin and had the superstitious idea that the image itself was somehow going to come to life and grant them favors, right? That would be a superstitious practice. If, however, they do it in the proper spirit, the way the Church tells us to do it, which is to think that that honor that we pay to the icon is really directed to the archetype, and the image is a holy reminder, as Mother Angelica would tell us, to lift our eyes away from things of earth to things of heaven, then it can have all of the benefits that the Church ascribes to popular devotion. But any devotion, any spiritual practice in the Church can be taken superstitiously. Even the Eucharist can be taken in a superstitious manner. So we don't ever take something for granted just at its sort of material ritual level. It always has to be integrated into the dogmatic structure and teaching of the Catholic Church and purified from any hint of superstition. That's part of what it means to be a Catholic and to love God with our minds as well as our hearts.
Sean is in Atlanta, Georgia. He is watching us today on YouTube in Atlanta. Sean, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, I sure hope you can help me. I've been doing some online evangelization of this YouTube station hosted by Alex O'Connor, who's an atheist and who has a theology and philosophy degree from Oxford. So people see him as an expert. But he's become like a Bart Ehrman.
What's the guy's name again? What's the guy's name?
Alex O'Connor.
Alex?
O'Connor.
O'Connor. Got it. Thank you. Keep going.
Yeah, he's become like a Bart Ehrman.
I got you.
Harem warfare and on the band, and he loves and slavery. He loves debating this topic. I watched him debate even Jordan Peterson, lots of people, and they all really kind of fail doing it. William Lane Craig gave the divine command theory, and that didn't go well.
Oh, I would not go there.
Whoopi,
I wouldn't go there.
And then Rabbi Whoopi told him, I'm not a literalist without really going Marcion. But I find this hard to explain it to people without faith because, you can only see it in light of the cross. I mean, you can give them some things. So how do I explain this?
Yeah, I can tell you. I can help you. I can help you. I really appreciate it. Okay, so first of all, since you threw it out there for the sake of the audience, let me explain what divine command theory is, which I do understand that is Dr. William Lane Craig's response to this problem. That's a typical Protestant intellectual response to this problem. What is the problem? The problem is that in sacred scripture, it appears that God does or commands unjust things, particularly in the Old Testament. I'm just putting it baldly. That's the problem. In Calvinism and in Lutheranism, or at least in Martin Luther's mind, that was compounded by their doctrine of predestination. Because in the Calvinist system, God creates the majority of the human race in order to send it to hell. I mean, just flat out, that's why he creates humans, is to damn them. And that intuitively strikes us as tremendously unjust. And what John Calvin and Martin Luther both said in response to that objection is, who are you, O man, to talk back to God? It's just in virtue of the fact that God commands it. And so if God commanded murder and adultery and rape and pillage and torture, then murder and adultery and rape and pillage and torture must be okay because God commanded them. So right and wrong just reduce to whatever God says. That's divine command theory. The Catholic Church historically rejects divine command theory. There are a couple Catholic thinkers in history who have held it. William of Ockham, most famously, and he's not a big hero among Catholic intellectuals. But the majority position in Catholic intellectual history is to reject divine command theory, and instead to argue that God is fundamentally good, that goodness is a property of his nature, that God's goodness underwrites our goodness, and that includes the goodness of our own intellect, and that we have a rational capacity to discern the good independent of revelation. And while we can make mistakes in how we discern natural law, the basic principles of natural law and equity are written into the fabric of our rationality. And so many of our basic moral intuitions are reliable. And things like, you shouldn't enslave your neighbors or torture children or whatever, that those are reliable intuitions. And so when confronted with the evident problems of the Old Testament, the traditional Catholic interpretation has been not to take the Old Testament at face value, but to and there's a lot of ways of doing this, but basically to argue that there is, in addition to the literal sense of Scripture, that there is a spiritual sense that transcends it, and sometimes can stand somewhat in tension with the literal sense. Now, I think this practice dates from Jesus. I think Jesus did this. And so, in particular, in Matthew chapter 19, when he was confronted with the Pharisees about the legality or the validity of divorce, and the law of Moses said that a man could divorce his wife for any reason. They asked Christ, can a man in fact divorce his wife for any reason? Jesus said, no. They said, well, then why does the law of Moses say otherwise? And Christ's answer was, well, Moses wrote these things because of the hardness of your heart. In other words, he asserts the principle that elements of the Old Testament are a condescension to human weakness and to the parochial point of view of a particular time and place, but that it was not thus from the beginning. Rather, God made them male and female. What God joins together, man can't separate. St. Paul does the same thing, but he offers a even more elaborate theoretical justification. So the idea that the literal sense needs sometimes to be relativized in light of higher principles like justice and equity and charity is woven into Jesus' own hermeneutic of the Old Testament. When you get to the 3rd and 4th century fathers, Origen of Alexandria, probably the most important Catholic biblical interpreter of all time, went pretty radical on this, and he actually wrote once we should throw out the literal sense of the Bible like the bitter rind of a nut. Now, the Catechism of the Catholic Church doesn't go that far, but it comes close. And a great book, magnificent book on the topic, and if you're interested, I highly recommend you read it, is by Matthew Ramage of Benedictine College, and the title of the book is The Dark Passages of the Old Testament, Reading the Bible with St. Thomas Aquinas and Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict was all about this, all about integrating the insights of biblical higher criticism with patristic and medieval insights about the spiritual sense of the Bible, and he says flat out that the interpretation of the difficult passages, the hard passages of the Old Testament, basically shouldn't be left to amateurs, and that doesn't mean that you have to have a degree in biblical studies, but it means you do have to have a profound sensitivity to the mind of the Church, to the history of Catholic interpretation, as well as to the historical critical literature, in order to properly integrate this into your Catholic faith. And so I'm very familiar with the modern sort of new atheist assault on the Bible, and they love to go after the character of the Old Testament God. I get that. But in doing so, they're basically attacking Protestant fundamentalists. They do not engage with traditional patristic and medieval Catholic hermeneutics on this question.
Thanks so much, Sean. We appreciate the phone call. I don't know how many of you are aware, but there are Eastern rites of the Catholic Church that are not Orthodox, that are in communion with the...
They're small Orthodox, but they're not big O Orthodox.
That's right. They're not big O Orthodox. And we've got a program that will help explain some of that situation for you. On Sunday mornings, it's called Light of the East Radio. It's 11:30 Eastern Time. Father Thomas Loya from the Chicago area, a Byzantine priest, and his guests explore the rites of the Eastern Catholic churches that are in full communion with the Pope. Check it out, Light of the East Radio, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, right here on EWTN Radio. Dennis is a first-time caller in Albany, New York, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Dennis, you're on with Dr. Anders. Hi, Dennis. Are you there? Tell you what, we'll go to Denise. Denise is in Valparaiso, Nebraska, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Denise, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, Dr. Anders. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure, what can I do for you?
Go ahead, Dennis.
Okay, so I just have a quick question. I was wondering if what Christ achieved on the cross, was that believed, has that developed over time throughout the early church?
Yes.
Or was there a development to it?
Yes, lots of development. The doctrine of the atonement has undergone several developments over the course of its history, and there are more than three, but let me highlight three major theories of the atonement, two of which are Catholic and one is non-Catholic. So the earliest patristic doctrine on the atonement is what Gustav Olain, the Swedish Lutheran theologian, called the Christus Victor doctrine of the atonement, Christ the victor. And this is the idea that by his death on the cross, Jesus defeated the demonic powers and the forces of sin, death, hell, and the devil, and liberated us from those forces. And there's a lot in Scripture to back that up. The biblical scholar Joel Marcus, who is the author of the Anchor Bible Commentary on the Gospel of Mark, for example, holds and also cites other secondary research on the idea that the Gospel of St. Mark in particular takes the Pauline idea that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, and that really undergirds the whole narrative of Jesus' life, that he begins his work by showing up in the synagogue at Capernaum, and the demons see him and cry out, we know who you are, the Holy One of God. Have you come to destroy us? And the answer to that question is, you bet! You bet! And his death on the cross is accompanied by these cosmic signs that the sun and moon are darkened. Darkness falls over the whole earth for, 3 hours or something. And so the way the Father saw this is that the devil basically is doing his worst. He's throwing everything he's got at Jesus, and Jesus defeats him precisely by entering into the domain of the death, hell, sin, and the devil. He basically hands himself over to the worst that the devil's got. And the result is that the devil is rendered toothless, because after throwing everything he's got at Jesus, Jesus doesn't tap, right? He comes out the other side in this glorious resurrection victorious. And so, the devil's kind of spent at that point, and humanity is invited into that victorious participation. And I could point to many other texts in the Pauline literature that would seem to undergird and sustain that idea. That notion is still very much alive in the Catholic Church, and it's very, very evident in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom and the Byzantine liturgy of the Catholic Church. That's the sort of the dominant model that you'll find, and it's part of my reflection, and should be part of every Catholic's perspective. There's another model that sacred Scripture also suggests, and that is that Jesus' death should be understood on the model of the Old Testament sacrificial system. And so St. Paul says that the death of Christ is a sacrifice of atonement. For example, the book of Hebrews says the same thing. And the way Old Testament sacrifices worked was that the worshiper brought something of value, made a gift to God in token of reparation for some fault or sin, to restore fellowship. The third model, which is Calvinistic and Protestant and not Catholic, is that the death of Christ is a substitutionary punishment, where Jesus is punished by God in our place. That doctrine is rejected by the Catholic Church. It's not Catholic. It is Protestant. The other two models are Catholic. There are other ways also of conceiving the atonement. Moral influence is one that St. Peter talks about in his epistle. I could go on, but hey, we're out of time.
Denise in Valparaiso, my apologies. We are flat out of time. On behalf of our host, Dr. David Anders, producer Pedro Quiles, our call screener Matt Gubensky, and our social media maven, Mr. Rich Jesse. I'm Jack Williams, sitting in today for Tom Price. Thank you so much for another great week of Call to Communion. Back at it Monday. Until then, God bless.